Showtime! Hi everyone, I'm Rosie.
I'm Bill. Welcome to the Rosie and Bill Show.
We're on the road yet again in Chester County, Pennsylvania at the East Brandywine Baptist Church. Bill, how did you do in history class?
Let's just say that's ancient history. Why are you asking me how I did in history class?
Well, if you're anything like me, not so well, I'm guessing. Because I just didn't have a great attention span, but today, I promise you, it's going to be a different experience.
Okay.
Giving a lecture today is teacher and historian Ross Kershey, and he is going to be talking about the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. Bill, where were you on Tuesday night, 1936, 33, 29, 87? When was the Lindbergh kidnapping?
I don't know where I was, but you probably heard about it in school that day.
Ooh, funny guy, funny guy. Well, obviously neither of us know when the Lindbergh kidnapping was, so we're gonna go inside and find out.
Hauptmann was found guilty. Did he do it? I don't think he did. Was it an inside job? Yeah, I think it was. I really do. Was Lindbergh himself behind it? That's where our story begins. They spent weekends in Hopewell, New Jersey. But this particular weekend, the little boy was sick. He had a flu. He had flu-like symptoms, so they stayed. If you'll notice, at the top of your sheet, I have it that he was taken on a Tuesday. And they usually were never in Hopewell on a Tuesday. But Lindbergh was reading down in his study, listening to the radio, when he heard a loud crack outside. He thought it was probably the wind breaking a branch off a tree, so he never thought much about it. We know now it was the homemade stepladder breaking, in which the kidnapper was carrying the baby down the stepladder, dropped the baby, fractured his skull, and was dead right then.
We are here today with teacher and historian Ross Kershey. Mr. Kershey, as I call you because he was a former teacher that when I went to Coatesville High School. We absolutely loved your presentation.
Well, thank you, Rosie. It was my pleasure to do it. I always enjoy doing it. I think it's obvious that I like what I'm doing.
And it is obvious. It is obvious, and you have so much detail. Before we get into kind of the meat of everything, some of the clips, you talked about the kidnapper coming down the ladder with the baby and dropping the baby. First of all, how do you even find that kind of information out?
Well, most of the things that you get from history books, from people who, no one actually witnessed this, but that's supposition, that the baby was dropped, the ladder broke, the baby was additional weight and wasn't qualified. The person who made the ladder didn't think about the additional weight of the baby. And as a result, the baby was dropped. We don't know that for sure. We assume that. That's assumed from history. It's not a fact, it's an assumption that you make.
But there's another piece to that too, Mr. Kershey, in that as you were describing that, you have this way of painting pictures with your words. Where do you attribute that from? I mean, I could visualize the story as you were telling it, almost the pictures in my mind.
After 57 years of teaching history, I think you acquire that. If you don't have it, you lose the people. And I'm teaching right now adult education, and I'm teaching people who know their history. So if you don't do that, if you don't create pictures, you lose them. They don't want facts. They want to know the story. And I think creating pictures is part of that. I've always been able to do it. And in high school and in college, and I think that's part of my success, is being able to paint pictures of history. Because otherwise, if I didn't find it interesting, I wouldn't do it.
Well, when did you first realize you had this passion for history?
I think it was when I first started teaching. It was probably my first or second year at Coatesville. My original intent, as you know, when I went to college was not to be a teacher, but I think it just gradually happened, Rosie. I'm not sure exactly what date or when I can say that, but I think it was my first or second year, and I really enjoyed what I was doing. And I think the kids enjoyed that I was teaching. They learned something about history, so that impetus made me move on and be very happy about teaching. I think that was it. My first or second year as a teacher.
Do you think that, because my understanding is, because I've done a little research myself looking at your history, if you will, and Rosie and I both have degrees in communications and from Westchester, and saw that you have your degrees in communications from Temple. I think back then it was radio, TV, and journalism.
That's correct.
I believe.
Yes.
Do you think having that background in some ways maybe helps you in terms of painting those pictures?
There's
verbally?
no question in my mind that it does, Bill. In fact, I saw the head of the department about 2 years after I had left Temple, and I told him, Dr. Roberts, I was in communications at Temple, but I'm teaching now, and I don't consider one subject that I had a waste of time. What is teaching if it isn't communication? And I think everything I had in communications has helped me become a better teacher. I really do. And as I said, what is teaching if it isn't communication? And that was very important to me.
Yeah, that's a
Well,
great point.
I know that Ross taught 42 years at Coatesville High School,
Yes.
is that correct? And now you're teaching adult education at Immaculata College.
Yes.
And I mean, my siblings, a few of my siblings had you in class.
Yes,
and
I remember.
I'll never forget them coming home and saying, "Oh my gosh, Mr. Kershey is the most amazing history teacher." They were excited to learn. And you don't find that very much.
No, I think a lot of the people I'm teaching now, they pay tuition, they want to be there, and so many people have come up to me from my adult education experience and said, if I would have had you in high school, maybe I would have liked history. I didn't like it, now I do. And I think maybe it's something that grows on you as you get older. You realize history is important to learn. If you don't learn from history, you'll make the same mistakes over and over again. So I think it's important to learn from history.
Well, you just answered one of the questions that we had is why is it important for kids and even adults to know their history?
I think it is important because I'm teaching a program down at Paoli Hospital pretty soon, I think in October, and the subject is Andrew Jackson. And my approach is, he was the first Donald Trump because he changed everything. From the first 6 presidents, Jackson was totally different. And he was a totally different president who did things his way. As I said, he might have been president 150 or 160 years ago, but he was our first Donald Trump. And I think as a result, from taking it from that aspect, the people are interested in it. Because Andrew Jackson, what do we care about him? No, what he did was relevant today.
He
And
was
I think that's
innovative
important.
at his time.
That's right.
I have to get back to the Lindbergh case for a
okay.
second because this talk was just so fascinating. One of the things that came up and that you made a very good case for was that the person that they actually tried, convicted, and killed for this crime, you put pretty good evidence out there that he did not.
I think we executed the wrong guy, yes. I don't know if he was part of the conspiracy, but I'm convinced he did not kidnap the Lindbergh baby. Because, as I mentioned, he was offered $90,000, which would go to his wife and son. He was to be executed anyway. Why wouldn't he confess? And he didn't. And he said, I didn't do it. I'm not confessing. I've never been in Hopewell, New Jersey, which is where the baby was kidnapped. So I'm convinced that Hauptmann may have been part of the conspiracy, but did not do it. He did not kidnap the baby.
Right, because you mentioned also about the time card and that witnesses had him in a different state.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, and that was something that intrigued me in that, you talked about how some evidence and even some testimony leaned one way before the trial.
Yes.
and then changed during the trial. Was anyone ever held accountable for essentially obstruction or false testimony or anything like that?
I think if the trial occurred today, they certainly would be. But it was in the 1930s, and they wanted to find a person who had kidnapped the Lindbergh baby. There was such pressure to find the guilty party. And I think everything that you mentioned was sort of overlooked. Like his boss in New York said, yes, he was here, then he wasn't. There were 2 sets of footprints, then there was only one. There were no fingerprints on the stepladder, things like that. Today there would be, as you said, obstruction of justice.
Yeah, and the currency that he used that could be tied back, that was more circumstantial than
Yeah, it was.
anything else, because he could have come across that in a variety of different ways.
Well, as he said in there, the man who left the money owed him money, so he used the money to spend. And that's certainly a reasonable explanation of how he got these gold certificates.
Has anyone ever officially reopened or looked to reinvestigate the case that you're aware of?
To my knowledge, no. The governor of New Jersey did not like the trial, but he was convinced politically it would be damaging to him if he reopened the case. So he let it go. I think the governor of New Jersey knew that there was something about the case that wasn't correct. But he was warned politically, if you reopen the case, you won't be reelected. And so he dropped it. Politics.
Yes, politics, and sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's the truth, and I think politics certainly entered into the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby, because the chief of police, Schwarzkopf, was pressured to find a guilty party. The district attorney who prosecuted the case, he was pressured. Find this man guilty. We need a person who convicted of the crime.
Right, to get the public off their back.
That's
to get
right,
the
they
family
had to.
Off their back. And that still happens today.
Yes, it does.
I did volunteer work in some prisons in New York City, and 3 of the men that were in this program were wrongfully convicted and finally released after 20 plus years. So it happens still today. Real quickly, the other thing I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned a man, I think his name was John Simon?
Yes.
Who grew up in where? Jersey?
Eagle,
in Eagle, Pennsylvania.
Not far from here.
Okay, and why wouldn't he have a DNA test?
I don't know.
He says, for those, the audience did not see his presentation, so John Simon claims to be the Lindbergh baby that was not killed.
Yes, he knew enough about the case. He knew things that no one else would know, according to my friend Dan Jones, who questioned him and talked to him. And as I said, John Simon made a good case, but he would not have a DNA test. And I think that probably indicates that it was all made up. But he actually knew quite a bit about it. And he lived in Eagle, Pennsylvania. I think he moved to Virginia. I'm not sure if John Simon is still alive, but it was an interesting case.
Boy, I
anyway.
wish he had done that. Could exonerate the name of Richard Hauptmann.
Yes, that would exonerate Hauptmann entirely, because the Lindbergh baby wasn't killed, according to John Simon.
Right.
The baby they found, the body they found, was not the Lindbergh baby.
Oh, it wasn't.
Right, and there's no way to prove back then that it was.
And there was no DNA, and the body was immediately cremated.
Wow. Well, folks, we've got a lot more that we're going to talk with Mr. Kershey about, a little bit more about the Lindbergh case, and we're going to go beyond that as well in terms of some other historical or history-related questions when we come back right after this brief commercial break.
Tom's Antiques and Treasures is changing its name, but not its 5-star service level. It's All Here and More is exactly what the name implies, an all-inclusive online store featuring activewear and athletic shoes for men and women, housewares, wall decor, and of course, antiques and collectibles.
If you're in the doghouse, a place I've often been, we've got beautiful jewelry for your special lady. Movie buffs and music lovers will love our selection of DVDs, Blu-rays, and eclectic collection of CDs and vinyl. And for the sports enthusiast, we have team jerseys, sports memorabilia, and barware.
Every order is exactly as advertised, packed and shipped with care, and will arrive on time and intact.
So no matter what you're looking for, you'll find it at It's All Here and More.
Your one-stop shop on eBay is just a click away.
I've got one last question, Mr. Kershey, with regard to Charles Lindbergh, because
Okay.
one of the things that really struck me in your speech today, and as I mentioned to you afterwards, my grandfather was Swedish and was a big Charles Lindbergh fan, and there were some things I learned that were less than stellar in terms of his personality, but then there was this tremendous sort of evolution in who and what he was. And if you could just tell our viewers a little bit about, kind of what he was like as a person, but then what it was that happened that caused him to fly 50 combat missions in World War II.
Yeah, Charles Lindbergh had visited Germany. He was very impressed by their Air Force. He was very impressed by Germany's political and military might. And I think he was head of the movement in America called America First. It was an isolationist movement that we should not get involved in World War II. And Lindbergh was very, very adamant in the fact that we couldn't win. We had no reason to be in this war. World War I had not solved anything, according to him. But after the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, he totally changed his attitude about that. And although he was never in the American Air Force, he was not allowed to be in the Air Force, he was a test pilot for Lockheed. And as a result, he flew 50 combat missions in the Pacific, shot down a Japanese airplane. He did have one kill that was registered. But Lindbergh, I think, changed his attitude after the attack on Pearl Harbor, became very patriotic, a very good American. And I think as a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was the impetus that really changed his mind.
Wow, that's pretty profound. I just found that fascinating.
It's
That
all
was absolutely
fascinating, and also that you said, you hear these great feats that these people in our past have done, and him sailing from New York to Paris alone for 33 hours.
Yes.
That's crazy. How did he stay awake, I
Yeah.
wonder. But then, so we always want to put these people up on a pedestal, and we think that they're great and fabulous, and then you kind of learn about their flaws, like you kind of communicated some of his flaws to us.
Yeah, Lindbergh was not the perfect man. He was certainly not the perfect husband. He believed in eugenics, and he wasn't sure that his son was perfect. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes people compare Lindbergh with having something to do with his son's kidnapping, which I don't want to believe. It would be very difficult for me to believe that a father would be involved in his own son's kidnapping. But Lindbergh was not very popular with his own children. He was very regimented, and as they were. And he would leave his wife for months at a time, and she would not know where he was. And we found out he had other children. And this has been proven by DNA. This is not subject to any speculation. He did, and he had other children. But again, this is something that just makes him maybe a human being and not an icon. He was a person with human faults and human frailties, and he was a man who, as I said, he accomplished many great things in his life, but that doesn't necessarily mean he didn't have flaws in his character.
Right, none of us are perfect. What is your favorite topic in history to teach, if you had to pick one?
I thought at one time it was the Civil War, probably the most traumatic event that ever happened in American history, the Civil War, the North and the South. We think we have problems now with the divide in our country between conservative, liberals, Republicans. In the Civil War, over 620,000 Americans were killed fighting each other. So I think at one time it was the Civil War. It probably still is, because in my opinion, it's the most important event that ever happened in American history, was the Civil War. Otherwise, we'd be a divided nation today, more so than we are, much more so.
That really puts things in perspective. And if that may be your favorite topic, and I'm curious, today you talked about Charles Lindbergh. I know you've got a lecture coming up on Amelia Earhart.
Yes.
I'm curious, though, Mr. Kershey, how do you go about deciding who or what it is that maybe kind of makes your list of things that you like to speak about?
I try to make up a list of things that I cannot do in one session, such as World War II, such as the 20s or the 30s, the decades. But the individual characteristics that you heard today about Lindbergh, those are the ones I try to pick out. For example, I do programs on individual presidents, on things like the Lindbergh kidnapping, Amelia Earhart. single events, the disappearing colony of Roanoke, Virginia, Roanoke, North Carolina, rather. Things like that I think would be of interest to the people, that maybe is something that was maybe slighted in their history class in high school, but I think they would find it in something important today, something important to think about today. I make up the individual list myself, but I usually give groups such as we are today in a church the option of picking out which one they would want to hear. So that's why we heard Lindbergh today. I sent them a list of my list. They picked out what they wanted to hear.
Out of all the historical people that you have studied, is there someone that jumps out at you that you maybe admire the most? And
Yes,
that's a two-part question. If so, is there someone, if you could pick someone's life to go into, to live a day in the life of, who would that be, and are they the same person?
Yes, they are. And my choice at one time would have been Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon. But the more I've taught and the more I've experienced in my life, I want to be Lewis or Clark, the Lewis and Clark expedition, to find out what this country was like before we messed it up. Because I think Lewis and Clark, we knew far more about the moon before the astronauts landed there than Lewis and Clark knew about the next bend in the river. They didn't know anything, and they faced mountains and rivers and hostile natives and weather. And I'm not minimizing what the astronauts did. After all, they went 250,000 miles, and we're approaching the 50-year anniversary of that event. But Lewis and Clark were amazing, and the entire expedition, which lasted over almost 2.5 years, they lost one man, and he would have died if he was in a hospital in Philadelphia because he had appendicitis. They didn't know what to do with that in 1804, 1805, so he died. But I think the Lewis and Clark expedition would be what I would want to go back to in American history. And I want to be Lewis or Clark. I want to find out what this country was really like.
You are brave. You are a pioneer.
But at one time it was Neil Armstrong, but that kind of ended the more I taught. And I followed the Lewis and Clark Trail all the way out to Oregon on one of my trips. And I think what they did was amazing, absolutely amazing. And by the way, Clark drew a map of visual. He said that tree looks like it's a quarter of a mile. They drew a map of 4,261 miles. He was off by 40 miles. He was off by less than 1% of over 4,000 miles. He was off by 40 miles.
And he didn't have Google Maps or Waze.
He didn't have anything.
Then.
It was all visual. How far is that next tree? How far is that next rock? And
wow.
Yeah. So they were amazing people, Lewis and Clark.
Is there any figure in history where maybe at one point you had a certain viewpoint or opinion of them, but after you did more research and studied them, maybe changed, either good, bad, indifferent? Just kind of curious if the knowledge that you've attained, has that caused you to change your feelings about anyone?
Yeah, I think so. I think about a lot of people. Just one such example is Ulysses S. Grant, who was a general and then president. Mm-hmm. And you get the idea that Grant was not a very good president. Perhaps he wasn't, but he was a very good man. He had very good personal qualities. He was a good person. Franklin D. Roosevelt. A lot of people don't know that Roosevelt, there was an attempted assassination on his life shortly after he was elected. And the mayor of Chicago jumped in front of the assassin and took the bullet and was killed. And Mayor Cermak looked up at FDR and said, "I'm glad it was me, not you." Wow. Things like that. They give you an insight to a person's character. And I think perhaps Grant is one that I changed my viewpoint on. And FDR, he was elected 4 times in the country. And as a result, we had an amendment to the Constitution that you can only serve 2 terms. And every time I speak to my people at Immaculata, they say, and there should be a term limit on Congress as well. If we have 2 terms for the president, we should have 2 terms. How do you feel about that? Absolutely. I'm in favor of it. There should be a Congress. I don't think you should have men who serve in Congress till they're 100 years old. Right. And we've had that already.
Yeah, well, the only real maybe lifetime appointment could be the Supreme Court, which I know you speak on as well.
Yes, I do, a program on the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, I'm doing that in the month of August. And the Supreme Court gets a lot of news anymore. And I like the man who said, we're not last because we're always right. We're right because we're always last. meaning they are the final arbiter.
final
Once the
stop.
Supreme Court's made a decision, that's it. It stands. And I think, as I said, the Supreme Court is very, very, it should not be political, but I'm hopeful it isn't.
All right.
Right now.
2 last questions before we wrap things up. 1, most influential woman in American history, and 2, your favorite president.
I think probably the most important female thus far in American history has been Eleanor Roosevelt, because she was her husband's legs. When he couldn't do anything because of the polio, she did. She flew in an airplane with the Tuskegee Airmen. She went in a coal mine with the coal miners. I think maybe it was Eleanor Roosevelt at the time. And what was your second question, Rosie?
Who's your favorite president?
My favorite president is probably Teddy Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt accomplished many great things. For example, a lot of people say it was Abraham Lincoln, but I think the question would be, do great times make great presidents, or do great presidents make great times? He was president during the big crisis of the Civil War. So Lincoln is always regarded number one. I like Teddy Roosevelt. And many people don't know, he was our youngest president. They think it was JFK. It was not.
Right.
JFK was our youngest president ever elected at age 43. Teddy became president at age 42. So I like Teddy Roosevelt. And you know why I like him? Because he wasn't a Republican or a Democrat. He was a statesman. That's what I like about Teddy.
Wow, that's great. Well said.
Well, folks, we have just packed a lot of history, a lot of facts, and a lot of knowledge into just one episode here of the Rosie and Bill Show. Thanks to Mr. Kershey. It's such a pleasure seeing you today, and even greater pleasure having a chance to get to know you a little bit more and have you here on the show. So thank you so much.
It was
for
my
joining
pleasure
us.
doing this.
Definitely one of the best
Yes.
orators that I have personally know.
Okay, thank you very much,
It's
Rosie.
a pleasure.
Yes.
Thank you so much, folks.
Yes, and as always, and Mr. Kershey's been doing it for a long time, make a difference for someone every day and make every day a great day.
Be kind to yourself, and we'll see you next week.
Hauptmann was found guilty. Did he do it? I don't think he did. Was he part of the situation? He may have been. I don't know that. But I don't think he kidnapped the Lindbergh baby. I think it was an inside job. How did they know the baby was going to be at the home on Tuesday when always they left after the weekend was over? They interviewed one lady named Violet Sharp. She gave one story about, she was worked at the place as a maid. She gave one story to the police. They came back and questioned her a second time. She gave a different story. They came back to question her a third time. She had committed suicide.